In 1842, the Prussian state passed a law that made it illegal for the poor to gather fallen branches from the forest. For generations, families had survived those winters on that wood. Now, the forests belonged to landlords, and the poor to punishment. In Cologne, editing a small newspaper, Karl Marx read the statute and paused. It was just a law about firewood. But to him, it exposed something deeper, a world where poverty itself had become a crime. What kind of society protects trees more carefully than people? What kind of justice demands obedience but denies survival? Marx began to ask a simple question. Why do laws defend property more fiercely than they defend the people who create it? Why does labor build the world, yet remain powerless before it? Those questions would change everything. To answer them, he left philosophy behind and walked straight into history. Europe was changing. Factories rose where forests once stood. Children worked 16-hour days. Empires grew rich, but hunger grew faster. To many, this was progress. To Marx, it was proof that progress had a price, and someone else was paying it. What he saw wasn't just inequality, it was a pattern that repeated in every mine, every mill, every wage slip. The few owned, the many served, and the system called it order. Then he met Friedrich Engels, an industrial heir who saw the same injustice from the inside. Together they began to ask a new question. If the world is built on exploitation, can it be rebuilt on equality? Their collaboration would ignite movements, revolutions, and arguments that have never faded. But every idea demands a cost. Marx was exiled from his homeland, censored across Europe, and forced to live in poverty in London. He and his wife raised their children in a single cold room, surrounded by unfinished manuscripts and unpaid bills. One by one, most of his children died, yet he never abandoned his belief that knowledge could be a weapon. He wrote, not for kings or scholars, but for those who had been silenced. He believed that understanding the system was the first step to changing it. This is the story of that understanding, how one forgotten law about firewood revealed the hidden architecture of power, and how a man with nothing left to lose gave the world a theory that still shapes it. Long ago, the Greeks told the story of a titan named Prometheus, a rebel who dared to steal fire from the gods. He gave that fire to humankind, the gift of warmth, of light, of progress. But the gods did not forgive him. They chained him to a rock, and each day an eagle tore at his liver, punishment for giving people the power to think and create for themselves. Still, Prometheus became a symbol of something bigger than his pain. He stood for knowledge, for defiance, for the belief that truth is worth suffering for. Almost 2,000 years later, another man tried to do the same. But the fire he offered wasn't made of flame. It was made of ideas. His name was Karl Marx. He challenged not the gods of Olympus, but the new gods of his age, kings, empires, and the invisible power of capital. He tried to give ordinary people something they had been denied, the knowledge of how their world truly worked. And like Prometheus, he paid for it with everything he had. But what was this fire he gave us? Why did it spread so far? And why, even today, does it still burn? To find out, we need to go back to the moment when one small law, about something as simple as firewood, changed everything. The firewood law was only the beginning. For Marx, it was like seeing the curtain pulled back, and he could never unsee what was behind it. He had touched a nerve. His newspaper articles, sharp, fearless, and angry, began spreading across Prussia. The poor admired him. The powerful began to fear him. Soon, officials arrived with warnings. Censors crossed out his paragraphs, then his pages, then his name. Finally, they shut his paper down completely. But the silence only made the noise louder inside his mind. If a simple truth, that people deserve fairness, was too dangerous to print, then maybe the problem wasn't just bad rulers or bad laws. Maybe it was the system itself. In those days, Germany was not a single country, but a collection of kingdoms and empires, each ruled by its own mix of pride, religion, and fear. Factories were multiplying, cities were swelling, and inequality was growing faster than progress. The world was changing, but power refused to change with it. Marx had started as a writer. Now he became a seeker. He began reading everything he could find on history, politics, and economics, trying to understand why injustice kept repeating itself. That search led him to Paris, the city of exiles, revolutionaries, and dreamers. It was there that he would meet the one man who would change his life and help him turn anger into a movement. To understand how that meeting reshaped the modern world, we have to step into Paris, a place bursting with ideas and about to explode. Trier, the town where Karl Marx was born, looked peaceful from the outside. Stone bridges over the Moselle River, vineyards on the hills, and the sound of church bells drifting through quiet streets. But beneath that calm surface, the air was still heavy with the aftershocks of the French Revolution. Old empires had fallen and risen again. Freedom had been promised, and then taken back. People talked of liberty, but lived under the same chains with new names. Marx was born into that contradiction in 1818, a child of a world that couldn't decide if it wanted to be free. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer, educated, rational, and proud of his mind. But in Prussia, reason didn't protect you from discrimination. The law said that no Jew could hold a government position. So, to keep his job, Heinrich converted his family to Christianity. It was a quiet act of survival, but a loud lesson for his son. Karl saw that even the most educated man could be forced to kneel before power. That freedom on paper meant little when fear ruled reality. In their home, books covered every table. Rousseau, Voltaire, Locke, thinkers who asked why kings ruled and why people obeyed. Karl read them early, devouring their ideas not as schoolwork, but as provocation. His father encouraged him to think, but also to stay cautious. Truth is precious, Heinrich once warned, but truth can cost you. Outside the Marx household, Trier showed him another education, the one you can't learn from books. Factories were beginning to rise. Farmers were sinking into debt. He watched children in torn clothes begging in the same streets where priests and merchants walked with ease. He saw that wealth didn't mean wisdom, and that poverty didn't mean ignorance. Those images stayed with him. At school, Karl was brilliant and restless. He argued with teachers, questioned church sermons, and wrote essays far too long for his age. When classmates talked about careers, Karl talked about truth, and how hard it was to tell it in a world that punished honesty. Even then, he was searching for something. Not success, but understanding. What made people obey unjust laws? Why did so many work so hard yet stay poor? And who decided that this was the natural order of things? Those were not safe questions. They were the kind that could close doors or open history. Because long before he spoke of revolution, Karl Marx was already asking dangerous questions. And soon, those questions would lead him out of Trier, into a world that would test every idea he believed in. Next stop, the universities of Bonn and Berlin, where a restless student would turn rebellion into philosophy. When Karl Marx left Trier for the University of Bonn, he was 18, ambitious, brilliant, and restless. He stepped into student life like a storm. There were long nights of wine, debates, and poetry. He joined a student club that was half literary circle, half rebellion. They called themselves the Wild Ones. They wore scars from duels like medals of pride. One night, when words weren't enough, Marx picked up a sword. The duel was quick, a flash of steel, a line of blood across his face. He didn't win, but he never backed down. That scar became part of him, a mark of defiance he would carry for life. But behind the parties and the fights, something deeper was happening. He was searching for meaning. The old questions from Trier about justice and power still followed him. But at Bonn, he only found distractions. So his father, worried, moved him to Berlin, a stricter university and a stricter city. Berlin was different. Gone were the drinking halls and duels. Here, ideas fought instead of swords. And the battlefield was philosophy. Marx immersed himself in the works of Hegel, the philosopher who saw history as the unfolding of reason, the human spirit learning about itself. To Hegel, every struggle, every conflict, was just a step toward freedom. Marx admired him, but also felt something missing. Freedom wasn't unfolding for the people he knew. History didn't feel like reason, it felt like suffering. Then came Ludwig Feuerbach, who turned philosophy back toward the material world. He said religion was just humanity's reflection, that people had created God in their own image. Feuerbach brought philosophy down from heaven to earth, and Marx began to wonder if the same could be done for politics and economics. He started writing fiercely, essays, poems, critiques, questioning not only what people believed, but why they believed it. And for the first time, he caught the eye of the authorities. His writings were too bold, too direct, too dangerous. Universities watched him. Censors began collecting his papers. The line between student and threat was getting thinner. It was during these years that Marx's restlessness turned into conviction. He realized that philosophy wasn't enough. It could explain the world, but it couldn't change it. He wrote, "Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." That sentence would echo through generations. But for Marx, it was more than theory. It was a decision. From that point on, thought and action would no longer be separate, because the student was becoming the rebel. And soon, the rebel would become an exile. But ideas alone wouldn't survive the state's watchful eye, and Marx was about to learn how far power would go to silence them. In 1842, Karl Marx was no longer a student lost in philosophy. He was a man on fire, and he needed a place to aim that fire. That place was Cologne, one of the few cities in Prussia where ideas could still breathe. There he joined a new newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung. It began as a moderate paper, cautious and polite, but when Marx became its editor, caution went out the window. Every issue started to sting. He wrote about poverty, injustice, and corruption, not as abstractions, but as daily crimes. He exposed the hypocrisy of laws written to protect the rich. He mocked politicians who quoted morality while exploiting workers. Readers loved him. The government did not. Soon, censors began tearing through the newsroom. Sentences vanished, then paragraphs, then entire articles. Marx fought back, rewriting columns so the meaning still slipped through. Sharp enough for readers to understand, subtle enough to confuse the censors. It was a battle of wits, ink against authority. But he knew who would win in the end. Then came the Forest Law, the same one that had haunted him since Trier. He published an article exposing its cruelty in detail. He named names, printed numbers, and showed how the rich had turned survival into theft. The reaction was immediate. Officials called his writing a danger to public order. The Russian Tsar himself complained to the Prussian king, a foreign ruler demanding the silencing of a German journalist. That's when Marx realized how deep the fear went. In 1843, the government shut down the Rheinische Zeitung. Just 2 years after its founding, it was gone, censored, dismantled, erased. And Marx, the man behind its words, was branded the most dangerous editor in Germany. But danger, for him, was confirmation. It meant he had finally struck at the root, not just the branches. With his paper gone and his country turning against him, he had a choice: stay and surrender his pen, or leave and sharpen it. He chose exile. Marx packed his manuscripts, his convictions, and his growing anger, and crossed the border into France, to Paris, a city where ideas were currency and exiles from every nation gathered to trade them. Exile would destroy most men. For Marx, it became a laboratory for revolution. When Karl Marx arrived in Paris, it felt like stepping into the heartbeat of a new world. The city was alive, a restless mix of poets, painters, revolutionaries, and dreamers. Every cafe echoed with argument. Every street corner felt like a stage for rebellion. Here, ideas weren't whispered. They were shouted, debated, fought for. In Germany, Marx had been silenced. In Paris, words were weapons. He wrote for radical journals, met exiled thinkers from Italy and Poland, and walked through crowded workers' quarters, watching people struggle just to eat. The smell of ink, smoke, and hunger filled the same air. It was philosophy made visible, and it hit him harder than any book ever could. Then, one day, a visitor arrived at his small apartment, a man named Friedrich Engels. He was everything Marx wasn't: calm, orderly, and from a wealthy industrial family. But what Engels had seen would change them both. He had spent time in the factories of Manchester, England, the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. He'd seen children covered in soot, men dying at machines, women crushed by hours of endless labor. He had seen what progress looked like from below. When Engels shared his notes and stories, Marx listened like a man hearing the missing half of a sentence he'd been trying to write for years. He realized that the world wasn't driven by ideas or morality. It was driven by material conditions, by who owned and who worked. History, he began to see, wasn't the story of kings and philosophers. It was the story of class struggle, not good versus evil, but power versus survival. Together, Marx and Engels began to map that hidden machinery. They talked for hours, filling pages with theories that connected philosophy, economics, and history into a single thread. The questions changed from what is truth to who benefits from it. Their partnership became a kind of alchemy. Engels brought data, Marx brought depth. Out of that fusion came a vision powerful enough to shake the old world. Late at night, they wrote by candlelight, turning outrage into analysis, theory into blueprints. And as their ideas took form, so did their purpose. They were no longer just writers or critics. They were engineers of revolution, and the system they were describing was about to hear its own diagnosis. Together, they would write a book that terrified kings. By 1847, Europe was trembling. Revolutions whispered through taverns and printing presses, and the old order could feel something moving beneath its feet. That was when Marx and Engels were approached by a small underground group, the Communist League. They asked the two men to write a clear declaration of what they stood for, a document that could turn scattered anger into a united cause. Marx agreed, and in a cramped room in London, he began to write the words that would echo through centuries. "The history of all hitherto existing society," he wrote, "is the history of class struggles." With that single sentence, he reframed the story of civilization, not as the march of kings and empires, but as the conflict between those who own and those who labor. He stripped away philosophy's ornaments and replaced them with urgency. The text was short, barely 50 pages, but it condensed centuries of thought into fire. It spoke directly to the working class, that their misery wasn't natural, it was constructed, that poverty was not a punishment, but a plan, that they had nothing to lose but their chains, and a world to win. It was called the Communist Manifesto, part prophecy, part weapon. When it was published in 1848, copies spread like sparks, smuggled across borders, whispered in factories, read aloud in secret gatherings. The language was plain, but the message was dangerous. The oppressed didn't need permission. They needed power. The reaction was instant. Governments banned it, police hunted down anyone caught distributing it, and newspapers denounced it as poison. But the idea was already loose, impossible to cage again. Everywhere, unrest began to boil. From Paris to Berlin, crowds gathered, soldiers marched, and monarchs prepared for the worst. Then, just as the word spread, the streets began to burn. By the spring of 1848, Europe was no longer whispering. It was shouting. Crowds filled the streets of Paris, Berlin, Vienna, workers, students, and soldiers demanding bread, work, and freedom. The words of the Communist Manifesto had barely dried on paper, and already the world seemed ready to test them. Marx and Engels watched as the theories they had written turned into banners and barricades. For the first time, the world looked like it might change. Marx returned to Germany, where revolution was stirring in every city. He gathered writers, printers, and activists, and founded a new paper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. This time there would be no cautious phrasing, no hiding behind metaphors. The paper printed in bold red ink, every word a challenge to authority. Marx wrote daily editorials urging the people to stand firm, to demand real democracy, not crumbs from the throne. He wrote with conviction, his words sharper than any blade. The paper spread fast, and so did fear among the rulers. Soon, soldiers were stationed outside the office. Threats arrived daily. One afternoon, the Prussian military stormed in, rifles drawn. Marx calmly placed a pistol on his desk. "Gentlemen," he said, "I must finish my article." They hesitated, unsure whether to arrest him or admire his nerve. The standoff ended without blood, but his legend grew. To the authorities, he was a traitor. To the people, he was a symbol of resistance. But revolutions are fragile things. In Paris, the barricades fell. In Berlin, the king promised reforms, then revoked them. In Vienna, the empire struck back. One by one, the uprisings collapsed under the weight of armies and fear. Marx watched it all unravel from his newsroom window, the dream of a free, united Germany turning to smoke. His newspaper was shut down, his name added to lists of enemies of the state. He was expelled once more, forced to flee with his wife and children. The revolution had failed, but Marx's faith in its necessity did not. He saw that power could be defeated in battle, but not yet in structure. And that realization would change how he fought from then on. Because defeat didn't silence him. It refined him. It turned the fire of rebellion into the cold focus of theory. And from that exile, he would begin his greatest work, the dissection of capitalism itself. London was meant to be a refuge. Instead, it became a test of survival. When Karl Marx arrived there in 1849, he was exhausted, broke, and blacklisted across Europe. He had outlived revolutions, lost his homeland, and carried with him only his family, his papers, and a few fading hopes. The city did not welcome him. London was the capital of the richest empire on earth, yet its streets were filled with the hungry and the forgotten. Marx and his family lived in a small, damp flat in Soho, their windows rattling from the carriages that passed below. The wallpaper peeled. The rent was often unpaid. They sold furniture to buy food, and sometimes they simply went without. He buried 3 of his children there, too poor to afford proper coffins. His wife Jenny fell ill. Letters to friends became pleas for help. The man who had once spoken of revolution was now fighting a quieter war, the war to keep writing. Through all this, one friend never abandoned him, Friedrich Engels. By day, Engels worked in his father's textile firm in Manchester, the very system they both despised. By night, he sent money, books, and comfort to Marx. Without Engels, the work would have ended. With him, it endured. And through hunger, loss, and despair, Marx kept writing. Not editorials now, but something far bigger. He was dissecting the system that had defeated every revolution, capitalism itself. In the British Museum reading room, surrounded by mountains of books and ledgers, he studied the hidden machinery of the economy, how profit was made, where wealth flowed, and why crises seemed to repeat like seasons. He wrote for years, his handwriting dense and relentless. The result was Das Kapital, not a manifesto, but an autopsy. He peeled back the layers of trade, labor, and money to reveal a structure built on exploitation. He argued that capitalism carried its own seeds of destruction, that greed would create crises, and crises would create change. The man who once edited newspapers was now dissecting the engine of the modern world. His pen had become a scalpel, cutting into the very heart of the system that ruled his age. He didn't live to see the impact of his work, but the world he described wasn't gone. It was just beginning, and soon his ideas would travel further than he ever could, reshaping nations, revolutions, and the very idea of freedom itself. Karl Marx died in 1883, in the same city that had once nearly starved him. There was no grand farewell, no monument, no headlines. Only a small group of friends stood around his grave in Highgate Cemetery, their shoes sinking into the damp London soil. Among them was Friedrich Engels, the man who had walked beside him through every exile, every idea, every loss. Engels spoke softly, his voice carrying in the cold air. His name will live on through the ages, and so also will his work. At that moment, it might have seemed like wishful thinking, the final kindness one friend could give another. But history had other plans. After his death, Marx's writings began to spread, quietly at first, then like wildfire. They crossed borders faster than armies, translated, copied, and whispered into the ears of workers and revolutionaries from Russia to China, from Cuba to Europe. His ideas became banners, manifestos, movements. They inspired strikes, revolts, and revolutions that reshaped the 20th century. But with that power came contradiction. Some used his theories to fight for justice, equality, and human dignity. Others twisted them into tools of control and violence. The same words that had called for freedom were sometimes used to build new prisons. And that is the paradox of Marx, the man who gave the world a language to challenge power, but not the guarantee of how that power would be used. He once said, "Philosophy cannot be realized without the abolition of the proletariat. The proletariat cannot be abolished without realizing philosophy." To him, theory and humanity were inseparable, one incomplete without the other. If the story began with Prometheus, it ends there too. He stole fire from the heavens and gave it to humankind. But fire does not choose what it burns. That choice belongs to us. Karl Marx gave humanity a mirror, not of what we are, but of what we might become if we truly understood the forces shaping our lives. And that fire, the fire of ideas, of rebellion, of understanding, still burns. The question is no longer whether it will fade, but what we choose to do with its light.